a time of question and answers, and then maybe a more informal time where those of you who are interested can come up and talk with him a little more questions that are more specific. So without further ado, let me introduce Dr. Phillip Johnson.
Is this microphone in the right position? Or?
That microphone's a light.
That's a light. All right. Yeah, we've got the camera, but in 1959, a great convocation was held at the University of Chicago to celebrate the 100th anniversary of the publication of Darwin's masterpiece, The Origin of Species. The Origin was a book which enormously changed humanity's conception of its place in the universe. Some would say irrevocably, others would say for a long time. But perhaps there'll be another change. But there was no sense that there could be another change in 1959 when all of the leading evolutionary biologists of the world gathered at the University of Chicago to celebrate the great triumph of Darwin's theory. It was the kind of conference we academics like to have, where people present papers and they have a lot of drinks and eat some good meals and they tell each other how good the papers are. And this was a particularly self-congratulatory conference because it was seen as marking the total vindication and triumph of the Darwinian theory and its worldview. The most honored speaker on this occasion was Julian Huxley, the grandson of Thomas Henry Huxley, who was called Darwin's bulldog, who really took the lead in debating the question on Darwin's behalf at the time immediately after the publication of The Origin of Species. Julian Huxley, the grandson, as of 1959, was a distinguished biologist and also world statesman and philosopher, one of the principal founders of UNESCO, the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, and author of Religion Without Revelation, a leading cultural guru, we would say today, as well as statesman and scientist. Now, Huxley's triumphalism was unrestrained on this occasion. I'm just going to read you some excerpts from what he said at this convocation of scientists as a keynote speaker. He said, "Future historians will perhaps take this centennial week as epitomizing an important, critical period in the history of this Earth of ours. The period when the process of evolution, in the person of inquiring man, began to be truly conscious of itself." Let's come on right in, yeah. This is one of the first public occasions on which it has been frankly faced that all aspects of reality are subject to evolution, from atoms and stars to fish and flowers to human societies and values. Indeed, that all reality is a single process of evolution. In the evolutionary pattern of thought, there is no longer either need nor room for the supernatural. The earth was not created, it evolved. So did all the animals and plants that inhabit it, including our human selves, mind and soul, as well as brain and body. So did religion. Finally, the evolutionary vision is enabling us to discern, however incompletely, the lineaments of the new religion that we can be sure will arise to serve the needs of the coming era. Now, these were not offhand words or casual statements of personal opinion on a minor occasion. This was seen as the statement of the spirit of the conference by, as I say, its most honored speaker among many very distinguished people. But why did Huxley insist that all reality is a single process of evolution? Why did he insist that evolution excludes creation? No, the earth was not created, it evolved, he said. Why are these two mutually exclusive? Understanding these points begins with a clear definition of terms, and I will say that one of the things one can learn from studying this subject that can be of use to you in other subjects, in general the debate or discourse about any issue of politics or religion or anything, is the importance of clear definition of terms. If the terms are vague, then he who can manipulate the definitions controls the discussion. Now let's us get the terms clear so nobody can do any manipulating. Now what is creation? Let's start with that. Now, the term creation, and especially creationism, has been used in the public realm, in newspapers, media, science textbooks, popular science treatments, public television programs, you name it, in a very special sense. A creationist, in this sense, is a biblical literalist, a person who takes the opening chapters of the book of Genesis literally as imposing an earth which is very young, approximately 6,000 or no more than 10,000 years old, and creation occurred in 6 literal 24-hour days in a 7-week period. Creationism, as I say, used in this sense, then is often linked with the term creation science, which is a movement which aims to give scientific support to the young earth, sudden creation position by making arguments of analyzing the scientific evidence, fossils, and experimental evidence, and whatnot. But this is a very specialized definition of creation and creationism. Taken more generally, a creationist is not necessarily someone who has a belief that the earth is young, or someone that has a position about the Bible, takes it literally or figuratively, or cares about it at all. A creationist is a person who believes in creation. What makes creation? Well, creation can be sudden or it can be gradual. It can take a few thousand years or a few minutes, or it could take a few billion years. There's no reason why creation cannot occur by a gradual process over, let us say, 4.6 billion years, which is the officially recognized estimate of the age of the Earth. Creation could be very gradual, and it would still be creation if the process of bringing the Earth and its living creatures into form were a process which was initiated and guided by an intelligence for a purpose. So that the really defining character of the term creation, properly understood, is quite independent of these questions about how long it took or how gradual it was. To put it in short, there's no inherent reason why God could not use a gradual process over billions of years of developing one kind of thing out of another, and we could call that creation. Now, in that sense, of course, there is no contradiction between the term creation and evolution, or it would sound like there is no contradiction, because many people, when they use the term evolution, just mean a long, drawn-out process in which one thing is developed out of another. And if matters could be left there, there would be no inherent contradiction between creation and evolution, and Julian Huxley could have said the Earth was created and it also evolved. But he didn't say that, and the reason that he didn't say it is that he he was using evolution in the sense in which the scientific community normally uses it. In the ordinary usage, in the usage which is universal throughout the evolutionary biology community, evolution does not mean just a gradual process of development. It means an unguided process, a materialistic process, a fully naturalistic process in which the elements in the process are strictly material. To simplify somewhat, one has the random elements, random mutations, random genetic changes, random changes of some sort, which are not guided. The new material comes into the process, the innovations, the first start of new things like wings and eyes and so on, comes in not because the creature wants them or needs them or something outside the process guides them, says this is the right thing for now, I'm trying to get things to go in a certain way. Let's have a certain kind of mutation. The mutations arise randomly and are in no direction whatsoever. And then such guidance as the process has is supplied only by natural selection, the survival of the fittest, which again simply means that some things live longer than others and have more children, more offspring than others. So if one has something that can be called an advantage, and it allows the organism possessing that advantage to produce more offspring than other organisms in the population, gradually over time, that advantage is passed down to the offspring in generation after generation who out-reproduce the others in the population, and so eventually you have the characteristic pass through the population, and then more random changes, mutations can arrive. And the theory is that by essentially this process, there can be a buildup of all of the complicated organs and systems which make a complex living creature such as ourselves. Now, the theory of evolution so understood, as I say, is a completely unguided process, which because of these elements does not require or permit the participation of anything outside of the natural world. And that is why it is said that evolution excludes creation. That's why Julian Huxley has said that, because if it were guided from outside, if the creator did anything to guide it, it wouldn't be evolution. Now, the theory of biological evolution exists primarily to explain two features of the living world. The first I've already made some reference to. That's complexity. All of the living creatures that we're familiar with, plants and flowers and trees and butterflies and bats and horses and monkeys and human beings and fish and whales and so on, are extremely complex aggregations of extremely complex aggregations. But even the simplest bacterial cell, the so-called prokaryote, bacterial cell, is a masterpiece of miniaturized complexity that makes the products of human ingenuity and engineering look rather low-tech in comparison. And the problem that science faced in Darwin's time was how could these extremely complex organisms, something like a very intricately crafted Swiss watch, let us say, even in the simplest form of organism, come about without someone to design, to put them together, without a pre-existing intelligence. And that was one problem. How do you get complexity, complex design, without the designer? Yes, why don't you come and make yourself comfortable and sit down. There's no need to stay there. Now, the second type of problem to explain was relationship. Living organisms seem to be put together in groups, and in groups within groups. At the lower level groups, we have species and genera, like dogs. A species of dogs are a species. One gets up from that somewhat more inclusive groups, genera and families, orders, classes, and so on up the hierarchy. So that we have, for example, we have the dogs, the whales, the horses, and the human beings within a group called mammals. We have mammals within a larger group called vertebrates, which are within a still larger group called animals, which contains many other groups, such as insects, which again have many groups within that general characterization. The groups within groups arrangement of the natural hierarchy of nature. And the question is, why do these groups exist? Why are, to put it another way, human beings so very much like chimpanzees in their appearance, somewhat less like rabbits, still less like snakes, and yet much more like snakes than they are like trees? What explains the existence of this pattern in nature in which there are common features common to all living systems. They have basically the same biochemical setup, a common genetic code, and a DNA in origin. Well, the theory of evolution, as Darwin proposed it, and as has been carried forward into the present world as neo-Darwinism, explained these two features with a tremendous grand concept, and a unified theory that's really rather simple to explain and understand in its essential, complex as it may be in its details, and which had tremendous appeal to the scientific and intellectual imagination. The explanation was that all of this tremendous complexity and diversity of related organisms had been built up by the simple process of parental descent that we see operating in the present-day world. Grandparents give birth to parents, parents give birth to children, to grandchildren, great-grandchildren, great-great-grandchildren, and so on down. If you extend this process through millions of years, Darwin thought, you can perhaps get a buildup of the small changes that might differentiate a parent from a child into the kind of big changes that differentiate one kind of organism from another. This was the process of descent with modification. As I say, it's simply the system of reproduction by the ordinary biological means which we see in the present-day world carried out to large. And that system, if it is true, could explain the relationship problem, the groups within groups. Because according to this idea, all living things possess the common ancestor somewhere back in the microscopic world of bacterium. And that the groups which were most like each other had a relatively recent common ancestor, and the ones that were a bit less like each other had a more distant common ancestor. So then the theory would go, humans and chimpanzees are relatively like each other because they have a relatively recent ancestor. All mammals have a common ancestor that's more distant. All vertebrates a still more distant common ancestor, and so on back. That would explain this pattern of relationships. Now, the theory meant to explain also the complexity, the complex adaptive features, wings and eyes, and hearts and brains, and livers, and fingers and toes, and all these things that are so tremendously hard to design and make, even in rudimentary fashion, by our relatively advanced science of today. And how is it all done without, brains and techniques to do it? Well, here, of course, is where we bring natural selection into the picture. The theory said that as small changes occurred by random methods and naturally, the certain organisms would possess an advantage in the form of some inheritable characteristic which they could pass on to their descendants, and if those descendants then produced more descendants than something else, they would gradually come to dominate the population, and they would crowd out anything not so advantaged. And by this system of continual improvements of a random nature happening to occur, the preservation and spreading of them through natural selection, one could, so it was hypothesized, build up these extremely complex systems. And one could explain common features that did not seem to be the product of common descent. One example that's often given of this is in Australia you have marsupial creatures, that carry their young in a pouch. We have the kangaroo, but they have an extinct marsupial wolf, which is very like, it looks an awful lot like the wolves of North America. It's developed the same pattern, but it isn't thought that they inherited the same sets of legs and so on, because the reproductive systems are thought to be more fundamental. And so it's assumed that they split off before they evolved all those common legs and features. And so those are the result, it was thought, of convergent evolution through natural selection, that was a design that was good, and so natural selection produced it more than once. So one can explain all these features by this theory. It's a beautiful theory. And if you're looking for that kind of thing, it's just a wonderful theory because, as Darwin thought of it, it's completely scientific. And by scientific, he meant it makes no room in it whatsoever for any miracles. At no point in the system does God ever step in and say, I'm going to help this along. It's not going fast enough. It's not going in the right direction. No, everything can happen without anything from outside. And in Darwin's time, as today, this was thought to be essential for a truly scientific explanation. So the idea was tremendously pleasing to people who wanted to have that kind of a complete explanation. It was very attractive to the imagination. And it is because of this factor that Darwin was always very, very resistant to suggestions, which he got all the time from other people, and especially including Thomas Henry Huxley, his bulldog, that if he wanted to make his theory consistent with the evidence, he'd better allow some jumps. I'll tell you why he had to do that in a minute, but you see, you better allow one thing to turn into another pretty suddenly, and with just a big leap instead of this tiny step-by-step process. Darwin said, no, that would be a miracle if I allowed that. If I allowed something new to appear all at once, it would seem to need, you see, some miraculous force to guide it, to make everything come out right. Whereas if it happens in tiny, tiny increments, maybe it doesn't, or certainly it doesn't. And so I'm going to stick to this system, even if that means that I have to do some pretty fast footwork in dealing with some objections that are made by the theory that would be much easier to deal with if I accepted Mr. Huxley's suggestion and allowed for some jumps. Huxley always put it in Latin, subsaltus, which just means jumps in Latin. So it was going to be a very gradual system. Now, you see the system so maintained. Now we can really begin to see why this is a completely naturalistic system and why, as evolution, it can't be creation also. Because there's nothing for the creator to do. And that's why Huxley said that the evolutionary consciousness, the evolutionary understanding, it provides neither need nor room for the supernatural. It didn't need the supernatural, and the supernatural was never involved, only the natural was. And so it was a process unguided by anything outside of itself. And the same point was put in a great summary by George Gaylord Simpson, the Harvard paleontologist who was one of the main founders of the modern neo-Darwinistic synthesis in the 1930s. In his book, The Meaning of Evolution, he explained it as follows. He said, although many details remain to be worked out, it is already evident that all the objective phenomena of the history of life can be explained by purely naturalistic, or in a proper sense of the sometimes abused word, materialistic factors. They are readily explicable on the basis of differential reproduction in populations. That's natural selection, survival of the fittest. And the mainly random interplay of the known processes of heredity. That's random mutation. And then Simpson closes with the punchline. Man is the result of a purposeless and natural process that did not have him in mind. That is what follows. And the position, this is a philosophical position which goes by different names: scientific naturalism, scientific materialism, evolutionism. And it says that you may believe that God exists if you like, but existing is the only thing that God ever did. Because God never, what God emphatically did not ever do is any creating. That was all done, operated perfectly well without God. So you might as well forget about the fellow who has never found any useful employment. That's the theory. And that's the consequence of the theory. And that's why Huxley saw that it would have to be the basis for all future religion, because it's not doubt the previous religion, if it's true. But there's the question. Is it true? Now, we certainly see that we have a reason at this point why people other than professional evolutionary biologists want to ask this question, is it true? Because you see, a theory that explains that much and that makes that great a claim on us is something that has a great impact on the ordinary person and not just on the professional biologist. So if professionals from this field are saying, we have something that tells you that you are alone in the universe here, it is a meaningless universe that cares nothing for you. If you are to have any values, you will have to make them up yourself, because there's nobody up there who likes you, or dislikes you, for that matter. There's nobody up there who cares about you at all, because there's nobody up there. If that is what is the message that is coming out of evolutionary biology, then people are entitled to ask the question, how do we know whether this is true? And that's the question that I decided to put when I first took up this work that I'm doing 3 years ago when I was on sabbatical in England, and I really read up on the subject. I wanted to ask, is all of this true? Or specifically, I didn't want to ask, is the Earth 4.6 billion years old? You know, that didn't seem to me to be the main question. And I didn't even want to ask, was there a gradual process of development, that one thing was made out of another? That didn't seem to me to be the important question.